All right. Hello, psychology students. Today we are going to be looking at classical conditioning. That's what we'll cover this week. And the next week we'll jump into operant conditioning and we'll talk about the two of them. But for this week, all you need to worry about is classical conditioning. And that was that first video that we watched. And thanks to everybody who took those the survey. I will be posting that uh, probably either later today or tomorrow, so Wednesday, and there'll be an assignment attached with it. It'll be pretty straightforward. You'll just need to go in and pick and some of our results and explain what you think. But let's jump in on classical conditioning. We've got this cute little meme here. Pavlov, name rings a bell, right? Which, if you remember, well, you'll see it. It's a joke. All right, so classical conditioning. There's the formula, there's theorists, but essentially the idea is that there are three pieces of classical conditioning. There's acquisition, where a behavior is learned, right? There's extinction, where you forget the behavior, and then there's spontaneous recovery, where it comes back, right? So the stimulus. There's also the word stimulus we need to know, stimulus discrimination, there's generalization, there's habituation, and we're going to explain all of these things as we go. And then we have the applications of classical conditioning, what we can actually do with it, right? Because it's not enough to just have this thing, right? There's a purpose to it. So, what is learning according to classical conditioning? Learning is conditioning. It is a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to an experience, right? You live through a certain thing, and that changes the way you are, right? It changes how you behave. It changes how you exist in the world. So the idea there is that we learn by association. Classical conditioning says that we are constantly attaching two different things together. We're constantly associating what we're experiencing with other things. So classical conditioning is based on building those associations intentionally, right? So the idea is that our minds are naturally connecting events that are occurring in sequence, right? Things that happen one after another. We're constantly attaching those things to each other, and that then we're building these associations. And Aristotle, right, 2,000 years ago, suggested this law of association. So this is not a new idea. 200 years ago, Locke and Hume, right, these are two very famous philosophers. They are also reiterating this idea of this law. But it's not until our homeboy comes along, Pavlov, that we really get this, right? But you I think, already know how to associate. You already know people who have these associations, right, of two or more stimuli that allow you to anticipate events. And a stimuli to this, or a stimulus, is a thing that happens that you can feel or see or hear or smell. Anything that you can feel, that you can perceive, that you can interact with, that you can react to, is a stimulus. So let's take the stimulus of lightning. There's a flash of light. This by itself might not mean anything to you, right? But because it is then followed by a boom, right? Really loud bang, right? What's our reaction to a really loud bang? Well, we get startled, we wince, we maybe cover our ears. If you're a little kid, you maybe start crying, right? And so what happens after this happens over and over again? Little kids will see lightning, the thunder hasn't even hit, and they will already start crying, right? They're anticipating that loud noise. They're already wincing. And this is an association, right? Lightning is associated with thunder. The lightning by itself is just a flash of light, not scary. But when you tie it to that boom, kids will get scared of just the lightning. But there's positive ways to do this too, right? Another version could be, you're polite. You say, "Hey, please, may I have a cookie?" And then you get a cookie. So what is happening here? Well, we're strengthening this kid's behavior. Of course, if you do this right, then the kid will be super duper polite and say "please" all the time in anticipation of getting cookies. So what are the ideas of classical conditioning? And they originate from old philosophical theories, right? We're talking about Aristotle and Hume and Locke. But it's this Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov, who really is the first to describe classical conditioning and name it and lock it in. His work becomes really important for John Watson, B.F. Skinner, and if you remember me showing you those pigeons playing ping pong, that's the work of B.F. Skinner. And John Watson and B.F. Skinner are very, very popular in the 1960s. But you can see Pavlov down there, and you can see his experiment there on the right. So what is Pavlov's experiment? Well, you have the UCS, or the unconditioned stimulus, right? So this is an unconditioned stimulus. It produces an unconditioned response, right? So this is not, we are not conditioning here. This is just natural dog being dog. You put unconditioned stimulus in front of dog. The unconditioned stimulus in this case is food. Dog salivates, right? This is a normal thing, right? And if we ring a bell in front of this dog, the dog is not going to salivate, right? We have this neutral stimulus that has no meaning to the dog, which is this bell ringing, and it doesn't have a reaction. The dog doesn't care about the bell ringing, right? Now we know you put food in front of a dog, the dog will salivate. So during conditioning, while we're training this dog, right? And some of you are probably thinking, why are we training this dog to salivate to a bell? Just bear with it. So while this dog is having the unconditioned stimulus in front of them and having their unconditioned response of salivating, right, we ring the bell. And this is repeatedly presented just after the neutral stimulus. So the bell rings, dog gets food, dog salivates. Bell rings, dog gets food, dog salivates. You do this a lot. And eventually, bell rings, food doesn't show up, dog still salivates, right? We have demonstrated now that this dog has learned to associate this bell with food. They hear the bell, and the dog thinks, okay, food's coming. You can see this in human behavior too. People who have romantic partners who maybe have onion breath or bad breath, right? A kiss makes people feel romantic, right? Well, onion breath with someone and a kiss is still leaves people feeling romantic, and eventually gets to a point where onion breath by itself will make someone feel romantic, right? This is human being, just standard human stuff, standard reactions. So let's look at classical conditioning, right? This is unlearned stuff. This is passive learning. It's automatic. You don't have to think to do this. You do this all the time. Unconditional stimuli are things that elicit natural reflexive responses. So like food to dog is an unconditional stimulus, right? And the dog's unconditional response, of course, is to salivate, right? A shot in the arm is an unconditional stimulus, right? It's an unconditioned stimulus. And what is the unconditioned response to getting a shot in the arm? What's your reflexive response? It hurts. You don't like it, right? And a terrifying monster who's murdering people in a movie, what is your unconditioned response? What is your reflexive response? It's to get a little scared. So now let's take a look at what our conditioned stimuluses are here. What are we attaching to these things? So you ring a bell with the food for the dog. Hey, that's that experiment we talked about earlier. A nurse brings the shot. Okay. And there's music, right? You guys all know the music. You can imagine it for scary movies. And that's attached to it. So let's take a look at what happens here then. After a while, your body begins to link together the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. And so then you will take your unconditioned response and it will become a conditioned response. The bell will make the dog salivate. The presence of nurses will get people upset and anticipating that pain of that shot. There are people who don't like nurses for this very reason and don't like doctors for this very reason. And then there's also the music, right? For horror movies, we'll hear that horror music. We'll go, okay, what's going on now? Timing is also very important to classical conditioning, right? This thing has to happen first. The bell has to ring before the food. The music has to show up before Mike Myers. The nurse needs to show up before the shot. So the formula is here. Unconditioned stimulus leads to unconditioned response. This is the beginning. Neutral stimulus, then you show the unconditioned stimulus and it gets you that unconditioned response. But remember that neutral stimulus is going to become the conditioned stimulus. And if you do that second stage enough, eventually that conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus will lead to the conditioned response. You can get animals and people to react to that to that conditioned stimulus eventually as though it were the unconditioned stimulus. And that's the idea of classical conditioning. So let's take a look at this. You have a BMW commercial. It's got lots of pretty people in it. These people are watching the commercial. They find the people pleasing to look at. with repeated viewing, they begin to associate that car with a pleasant feeling, right? That's the idea of this BMW commercial. That's how we're doing it. Okay, let's take a look. What do we got? So what's the unconditioned stimulus? Pretty people. Okay, cool. So then what's our unconditioned response to pretty people? Feel good, right? See pretty people? It's like, yeah, that's nice. Okay, what's our conditioned stimulus, right? The conditioned stimulus, what does the car company want you to think, to associate with pretty people and feeling good? They want you to associate BMWs with it, right? And then what's our conditioned response? It's going to be feeling good, right? Your unconditioned response will become your conditioned response. But the idea is that just a BMW will make you be like, oh, wow, yeah. All right, car accident. And now you're afraid to get into a car. This happens. This is real, right? What's the unconditioned stimulus? The pain, the fear of the car accident, right? And what is our unconditioned response to this pain of the accident? That's fear, right? We're afraid of that car accident, as any reasonable person should be. And what's our conditioned stimulus? It's the presence of the car. Before this car accident happened, I was in the car, right? So the car was there, got in this accident. Now when I get back into a car, what is my conditioned response? Fear. All right. You go to a fancy restaurant. You decide to try an appetizer you've never tried before, escargot. For those of you who don't know, escargot is snails. After dinner, you go to a concert. You get violently ill from an unrelated thing. It's a stomach virus that's been going around. From then on, you cannot even look at snails without feeling sick. So, what is our unconditioned stimulus? The stomach virus, right? That's the thing that's making us sick. And what's our reaction? Well, we feel sick. Okay. Well, what is the neutral stimulus? What is our conditioned stimulus for the future here? It's that snails. It's those snails, right? And we are now going to associate those snails with feeling sick. So what is our conditioned response? Feeling sick. Hopefully that gives it to you guys. Hopefully you've got that locked in. There's going to be a couple. We'll put some of this on the quiz for sure. So let's say you're cruising on I-94, 85 miles per hour. You see a flashing police light behind you. You pull over, and the policeman gives you a ticket. You get an insane amount of trouble from your parents. The next time you see a flashing police light, your heart rate speeds up. What do we got? So getting into trouble from your parents is the unconditioned response, the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is increasing your heart rate. What was our conditioned stimulus, right? What's the thing that we are now linking? It is flashing police lights. And CR, of course, our conditioned response is that increased heart rate. And you'll notice, right, your unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response. They are always going to be the same. Your unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response. So let's talk about the stages of this, right? We talked about acquisition, right? And over time, it's going to bump you up into your acquisition is going to rise, right? How strong is this conditioned response? And a really strong one, something like a car accident, it only needs to happen once and you're there. But something like ringing a bell when a dog eats food, it's going to take a lot longer, right? It's going to take more time. So acquisition gets stronger and stronger and builds up, but it's at a curve, right? As time goes on, there's only so strong that you can get an acquisition. So that's that initial stage in classical conditioning, right? It's between neutral stimulus and that unconditioned stimulus. It's where that association is taking place. So the neutral stimulus, though, needs to come before the unconditioned stimulus for conditioning to occur. Conditioning can't occur if it comes after the fact, right? Ideally, the time between the two stimuli should be about half a second. No more than a couple of seconds. If you really want to lock this stuff in, it's got to go fast. And it has to be reliably predicted by the subject in order to make the connection. So if you can't reliably predict the thing that's going to happen, it's probably not going to work. Right. Then we have extinction. Let's say we stop ringing this bell every time before the dog gets food. At a certain point, the dog will completely lose the salivation response, right? And as time goes on, we will eventually, if saying please never nets a child a reward, eventually that child may stop saying please. When an unconditioned stimulus like food, right, this is what extinction is, doesn't follow a conditioned stimulus like the tone, the salivation starts to decrease, and at a certain point stops. It goes extinct, right? This is called extinction. But then there's spontaneous recovery, and every once in a while you'll see these behaviors come roaring back, right? And generally it's never to the same degree. And extinction, if just the conditioned stimulus happens by itself, eventually it will go extinct again. So after a rest period, an extinguished response, so say salivation, could spontaneously recover. If the tone persists alone, it will go extinct again. Stimulus generalization. So this is a tendency to respond to a stimuli similar. So the more similar the subject stimulus is to the original used in conditioning, the stronger the general response. Right, like how much saliva are we getting from a dog if instead of doing this tone, they are doing sort of a vibration on different parts of the dog. Apparently, dogs hear through their thighs. That's what I'm getting from these graphs. But a generalization, right? If you hear something similar, if you see something similar to what you're what you're used to, that can still cause stimulus, right? So, but then there's discrimination, right? Discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between your conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimuli, right? Or an unconditioned response, right? So changing the tone of the bell will change a dog's response to that stimulus, right? Like dogs will discern and like, nope, this isn't the right tone. This tone isn't going to do it. And then you have higher order conditioning, which is a sort of another level to it, in which you get rid of the food, you replace the food with the bell, right? So we can, we have the bell, we have food, it gets the dog to salivate. Then we get rid of the food, and then we have the bell that gets the dog to salivate. And we're going to add this little black square in too. And eventually, if you do it right, you can get the square to get the dog to salivate, right? Like these associations can go almost like the movie Inception, just an association within an association within an association. Yeah. So what is Pavlov's legacy? What do we have then, right? So we know this stuff works. We're pretty sure we know how it works, right? By association. What is his big contribution, right? What does this mean if we can make dogs salivate, right? And the reality is it allows us to isolate these elementary behaviors, right? These basic behaviors from more complex ones through objective scientific procedures, right? So if you have a behavior that you want to get rid of, you can get rid of it with classical conditioning. If you have a behavior you want to encourage, you can encourage that behavior through classical conditioning, right? So what are the applications? Well, John Watson builds on the work of Pavlov and classical conditioning to investigate the role of conditioning on emotions. You can see here a baby refusing to let go of something. I'm sure this is a very reasonable experiment, but it looks a little messed up to me. And this is, of course, going to lead to the entire field of psychology that is behaviorism, right? Then we, of course, have classical aversive conditioning, right? The baby Albert experiment. And we talked a little bit about that. This video is a little long. If you'd like to look at it, we'll link it in the comments. And it doesn't end well, right? Like the little Albert experiment, we did talk about that. Essentially, your unconditioned stimulus is a loud noise, right? And your unconditioned response is fear. You make a loud noise, babies get scared. That is standard human baby behavior, right? Big bang, loud noise makes baby afraid. Well, what do? They add in the neutral stimulus of the rat to the loud noise. And so what is going to happen here? What are they doing with little Albert? They are getting little Albert to be afraid of rats. And that's exactly what happens, right? The conditioned stimulus of the rat becomes the conditioned response of fear. And they literally take a little human baby and get him terrified of little white rats. Not only that, but they extend the relationship, and it turns out that this kid is now just afraid of all little white fuzzy things, right? And that is, of course, generalization, right? We talked about generalization before. Now, there are limits to classical conditioning in cognitive processes, right? And that's the big thing. Watson and Pavlov considered consciousness of the mind not fit for scientific study of psychology, right? You can't look at consciousness. You can't look at what's going on inside somebody's brain and really measure it. So they believe that learned behaviors, right? These are these physical things that you can measure, and that is what we need to reduce psychology to, right? We can reduce it to these mindless mechanisms which we can measure, and that is what classical conditioning is all about. It's a way to actually be able to measure things. They also, but they're underestimating, right, the importance of the cognitive process and the importance of cognitive processes themselves, right? Behaviorism is certainly a piece of the puzzle, but it's not everything. And so later behaviorists suggest then that animals are learning the predictability of the stimulus, right? So that it's not so much that this animal is just reacting without thinking, that rather the animal is going through its own thinking process and learning to expect or to be aware of this stimulus. And that's what later behaviorists are talking about. But let's get to what we can actually use this for in therapy, right? Like, how can we use this to help people? How can we use this to interact with human beings in real life, in real time? So, taste aversions, right? You have people who have learned avoidance of a particular food. Maybe it's because, they got sick, right? They had appendicitis right after eating Chipotle, and now they just can't eat Chipotle ever again, but they want to because all their friends loved eating Chipotle all the time, right? You can use classical conditioning to get over that. You can also use classical conditioning to help alcoholics partially reverse their positive association with alcohol. You can get people to move away from their desires for alcohol. What else can we do? We can counter condition it, right? You can use pleasant stimuli paired with a fearful one, right? So if I'm afraid of spiders, right, we can show me spiders. Spiders are scary. I see a spider and then I get ice cream. And if we do this enough times, eventually I'll see a spider and I'll pair that idea. I will associate that idea with ice cream. And so spiders will no longer frighten me. Instead, they will make me start to wonder whether I want Rocky Road or vanilla. And you also have something called flooding, right? And this is exposed to stimuli until your fear responses are gone. So this would be like, okay, Mr. Holmes is afraid of spiders, so we are just going to put him in a box covered with spiders for 24 hours until he's bored of all these spiders, right? And he's just done. There's no more fear there, right? And that's flooding. Please don't ever do that to me. I don't want that. And then systematic desensitization, which would be a little more, if we were going to be nice, right? Relaxation techniques coupled with gradual exposure, right? So we're going to get a small spider that doesn't scare me too much, and I'm gonna, we're gonna put it close to me in a little box, and then maybe eventually we'll let it sit in my hand. And maybe if we're getting crazy, we'll let it crawl on my shoulder or something like that. And then you have the Bell and Pad, and then you have the Bell and Pad method. This is for children who wet the bed. It teaches children to wake up in response to bladder tension, right? So the Bell and Pad method basically gets kids to, when they have bladder tension, wake up, be like, oh, I need to use the bathroom. And then the kid will wake up and be able to go use the bathroom. It's a cool method. So yeah, there are things you can do with classical conditioning. There are important things we can use it for, and it's an important piece of the psychological puzzle and an important piece of the learning puzzle. Tomorrow we're going to talk about operant conditioning, but for right now, classical conditioning is all you need. That should get us done. Thanks for listening, and we'll jump in on operant conditioning next week.